Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this session today. My name is Nidhi Sachdeva, and I'm an educational technology researcher, an educator, and an advocate for evidence-informed teaching and learning. I teach science of learning in the teacher education program at the University of Toronto. My doctoral research focused on exploring how we design evidence-informed learning for online learning environments. I also co-author a newsletter called The Science of Learning, in which we share recent educational research in the form of edu-snippets for educators and learning designers. Before I begin my session, I want to thank the entire team at the Learning Development Accelerator for putting together such an amazing event for us all and for inviting me to speak today. It is truly an honor. Thank you. Today, I want to talk to you about a notion that Robert Bjork had called desirable difficulties back in 1994. The idea behind this phrase is that there are certain conditions of learning that at first appear to make progress of learning slower, but these are the very conditions that lead to long-term learning. Now, this has huge implications on how we design instruction or training programs, or even when folks may take on self-regulated learning. So let's unpack this term called desirable difficulties in this session. Here's the agenda for this session. Before we start getting into what desirable difficulties are, we have to first address some peculiarities of human memory and memory system. This will help us make sense of desirable difficulties much better. We will touch upon this theory called New Theory of Disuse by Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork. We will then begin exploring 5 conditions that have been categorized under the term desirable difficulties. Lastly, a word of caution: not all difficulties are desirable. This is really important to understand so we don't start making our training and instruction unnecessarily challenging. Let's begin. The Bjorks explain that human memory has certain peculiarities as to how it stores and retrieves information from long-term memory. Let's look at how the human memory system stores and recalls information. To make sense of it, we will go to the basis of it all, the information processing model. Many of you already might be familiar with this model because it's taught in educational psychology courses and in Psych 101 courses. If that's the case, please bear with me as I briefly explain this concept. If this is new to you, you'd find it useful to understand how humans learn cognitively, or how learning happens cognitively. First thing that happens is that the information enters our memory system. Let's see how this happens. This is how it goes. The information processing model begins with sensory memory. We receive information through our senses, primarily visual information and auditory information. Before new knowledge can be stored in long-term memory, it must first pass through and be processed in our working memory. Our working memory has a very limited capacity. It's what we're conscious of at any given time. Research suggests that we can only hold 4 to 7 chunks of information in our working memory at any given time. So for example, if I gave you a list of 3 random numbers, you could probably keep them in your working memory, and several minutes later, you could tell me those numbers. But if I gave you a list of 20 random numbers, it would be really hard to remember them all, because we can only keep a certain amount of information in our working memories. In some sense, we can think of working memory as a bottleneck. There are limits to the speeds at which learners can take in and process new knowledge. The final step involves a deliberate effort on the part of the learner to encode the new knowledge in their long-term memories. And we do this by connecting the new knowledge to what we already have. Now, initially, the new knowledge is encoded somewhat weakly. But with practice, we keep working with it, it becomes more firmly embedded. We create stronger and stronger linkages to the new knowledge in our long-term memory. And this is what we call learning. It's about storing new knowledge in our long-term memory so that we can access it again later. Once the new knowledge enters the memory system, the individual then encodes this information. Encoding of new knowledge is essential for any change in long-term memory to take place. Let's understand what that means. First, we have to understand that encoding primarily happens in our long-term memory. Now, what is encoding of new information? Encoding refers to how the brain transforms information into a memory. So instead of thinking of knowledge stored in long-term memory like a recording that can be replayed, it's more like a network where new information, the green squares here, get connected to what we already know, represented here by blue squares. We make sense of new ideas by linking them to things we understand, by storing them in meaningful ways, also known as semantic ways. For example, when we connect new knowledge to personal experiences, or when we try to connect new knowledge to possible future situations. Or we can also do something called elaborative interrogation, asking why and how questions about the new knowledge. Or we can embed it in a story that also helps us create semantic or meaningful connections. The important point to note here is that memory is not an audio or video recording that we can simply play back. It's much more complex than that. We depend on those established connections to be able to use that knowledge later on. So therefore, the more we revisit and connect that information through different contexts, the stronger those memories become. So the key to learning and remembering is how many times and in how many ways we interact with the information. Now let's say that the learner has successfully stored or encoded new knowledge in their long-term memory. It's natural then to see if we now possess this new knowledge. But how do we do that? This new knowledge is then pulled out from the memory for some kind of demonstration of learning. But this demonstration of learning isn't just for the purpose of demonstration for our memory system. It also acts as a learning event, meaning the act of recalling knowledge from one's long-term memory is a learning event itself. And Robert Buer calls this act of recall a memory modifier. By accessing information from a long-term memory, we end up learning it better. This also means if we didn't recall it, we won't be tapping into this potential of recall as a learning event, and hence the memory doesn't get stronger. Here's a quick recap of the peculiarities we just talked about. The information enters a person's memory, the individual encodes this information in their long-term memory, and then the individual retrieves or recalls this information, and this also becomes a learning event. One thing to understand here is that an item in memory is characterized by two strengths: storage strength and retrieval strength. Storage strength relates to how well someone has encoded and stored the information during the learning process, while retrieval strength refers to the current ease of access to the item, meaning how easily the person can retrieve information from their memory based on available cues. Important to note here is that retrieval strength is usually high right after an individual encodes new information in their memory, which makes sense. That immediate demonstration of newly learned knowledge is performance, but it is short-lived. As time passes, the retrieval strength decreases, and therefore performance appears to decline. So consider a corporate training session on a new software tool. Right after the session, employees can easily demonstrate the tool's features because retrieval strength is high. They perform well in a post-training assessment too. However, as time goes by, without practicing or applying the knowledge, their ability to recall specific functions declines, which impacts performance. So to maintain retrieval strength and long-term performance, they need ongoing practice or review sessions. This reinforces the learning and ensures they can effectively use the tool in their daily tasks. So the more you retrieve, the more you can continue to retrieve. Meaning, if you increase the retrieval strength of an item in your long-term memory, you're automatically increasing its storage strength because retrieval is a learning event. And the opposite is also true, meaning by not enhancing the retrieval practice of an item, we lower its storage strength too, which in turn makes it harder to retrieve. This is actually the basis of new theory of disuse, which essentially says that we don't really forget knowledge, it just becomes harder to retrieve over time if not used. Contrary to the belief that if we don't access knowledge, it fades away or decays from our memory. In other words, recalling is a good idea. As Robert Bjork says so beautifully, as we use our memories, the things we recall become more recallable. So the question then becomes, what can we do to support the encoding of new knowledge in our long-term memory? What do we need to do to remember information better and longer so that we're able to recall it when needed? The answer is highly counterintuitive, and therefore we often tend to miss it. Let me explain. Let's consider two scenarios here. In scenario A, you first learn something new. You manage to encode it in your long-term memory. How do you know that learning took place? You immediately perform some sort of task to demonstrate it. It usually involves a recall. You did it well, and you view it as learning. This, though, is not long-term learning yet. It's immediate performance. Let's consider another scenario. Scenario B. You do the same thing as in scenario A. You learn something new, but in this case, you added a variable before demonstrating the learned knowledge. This variable can be an added time gap before demonstration of learning, or a test, or a similar yet different context in which the learning needs to be presented. You'll notice that you can demonstrate your learning, but it wasn't as good as when you had the chance to present it in scenario A. You may find it hard to present your learning in scenario B because it is hard as a result of the added challenge. Your performance is reduced, and that is not a good feeling for anyone. It initially feels that the added challenge slowed down your learning because you're viewing your learning through the lens of performance. It feels difficult, sluggish, and ineffective. But the truth is, this very slowed down performance has just acted as a crucial learning event in the learning process. This, in fact, is going to lead to long-term retention. So what does that mean? It means that one-time performance is not the same as learning, but it also means that reduced performance does not mean that it's the absence of learning. And that is the counterintuitive nature of learning. Very, very important to think about. Reduced performance does not equate to absence of learning. The counterintuitive nature of learning means that what seems to slow down our performance at first is what's working to increase the storage strength of knowledge in our long-term memory. The implications of this counterintuitive nature of learning is that learners tend to pick the easy ways as they keep immediate performance intact. It gives us illusion of learning. And we all like that. And we tend to ignore the challenging ways because they surely will lower our immediate performance, making us believe that learning isn't taking place. But it is. And the truth is, easy isn't increasing the storage strength of information as deeply as the challenging task can do. This quote by Robert Bjork explains that so nicely. I'll give you all a moment to read the quote. This is the basis of desirable difficulties. What seems hard is what's going to make long-term learning effective, even though it will lower your performance in the interim. It's so important to remember that. Now, this brings me to the term called desirable difficulties. Desirable difficulties are challenges or conditions of learning that an instructor intentionally integrates within the learning and training process that can lead to long-term retention and enhance knowledge transfer. I want to repeat that these are the conditions of learning intentionally integrated so that long-term learning can take place. They are desirable because they make learning durable and flexible, because that is the target of instruction. But they're difficult because they temporarily slow down the process by posing challenges to learners. Temporarily slow down the process. Bjork has given us 5 ways to introduce desirable difficulties in training and learning. The first one is spaced practice. The idea here is to spread out learning over time. And this added time does slow down learning at first, but it is what produces superior long-term performance and hence boosts knowledge retention. Even though research shows that spreading out learning is more effective, most training is still packed into one session. This includes things like full-day workshops or completing online training in one go rather than breaking it up over time. So by spacing out the training over several weeks, perhaps with shorter sessions and follow-ups, employees would have multiple opportunities to revisit and apply what they've learned, making it more likely to stick. The second desirable difficulty is called retrieval practice or practice testing. The idea here is to recall something without having it in front of you. It often feels hard to recall from memory. It feels challenging, but this is what considerably improves long-term retention. Remember, we talked about recall is a learning event, and that in turn boosts knowledge retention. A very, very powerful strategy and also a desirable difficulty. The third one is interleaving. The idea here is to mix up related yet varying conditions of practice when we're performing a task. And this added challenge initially truly impacts our performance at first. It reduces it, it lowers the performance. But interleaved practice produces stronger long-term results. Here's an example. If you're working towards improving your tennis skills, what you want to do during practice is to mix up different shots. The natural tendency is to hit one form of shot, say forehand many times, and then another form of shot many times. But an interleaved practice would mix different kinds of shots almost at random. Some forehands, some backhands, some drop shots, some serves, and so on. This is challenging at first and also reduces visible performance, but helps to improve the game in the long run. If you think about it, that's how the player would have to perform in actual game, right? Being ready for any kind of shot. So true interleaved practice can strongly improve one's skills at a certain task. A word of caution here though. You want to mix related things, not drastically different things. So for example, practicing your baseball shots during tennis practice isn't a good way to interleave if the goal is to improve your tennis game. The fourth desirable difficulty is called contextual interference. This is actually a form of interleaving in which the task environment actually varies, or the context in which the task is carried out is varying. It's very challenging to perform with such variations. So sure, initial performance will seem to have reduced. But in the long run, this is what promotes adaptability, deeper understanding, and better retention. The fifth desirable difficulty is called reduced feedback. The idea here is to move away from frequent and immediate feedback to reduced feedback. It does make it challenging for the learner at first, but it is what leads to durable, flexible, and confident learning among learners and absolutely increases knowledge retention as well. Here are some ways to integrate desirable difficulties in training programs. You can space it out. You can use pedagogical approaches like microlearning. You can offer lots of options for recall through things like quizzes, brain dumps, polls, surveys, think, pair, share. and so on. You can mix the tasks up, but hey, do it carefully. And you can also vary the environment, the context in which the task is being performed. And you can hold back on the feedback, but timely, when the time is right, and cautiously. This is an important slide. Not all difficulties are desirable. Robert Bjork says the word desirable is key here. There are many ways to make things difficult for the learners, and that is not the idea behind desirable difficulties. Is your learner equipped to handle the difficulty? Desirable difficulties are only desirable when they trigger encoding and recall that can further support learning and transfer. If the learner does not possess the necessary background knowledge or skills, it is an undesirable difficulty, no matter its level. The challenge should be fair and not outside the training content's scope, because an undesirable challenge is overwhelming and frustrating for learners, and it goes against the idea of desirable difficulties, that we are using them to enhance learning, to make learning long-term, to make learning durable, recallable, and transferable. That was the context of desirable difficulties. Hope the explanation helps you and you can work towards integrating desirable difficulties in your training, in your instructional design, in your own learning as well. If you're hungry for more science and learning content and what's the latest in educational research, you can sign up for our newsletter. As I mentioned in my intro earlier, I co-author this newsletter with my colleague Jim Hewitt, who's also a professor at the University of Toronto. We don't inundate your inbox. We write once every 2 weeks for the newsletter, and it's free to subscribe. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this session. It was an honor speaking with you all. Have a great day.